Hey, everybody. So I do like it when people ask questions, and can everybody hear me okay? I have a really big mouth without the microphone, so I don't know what I'm going to do with this thing. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about relapse versus recovery, and this is really controversial because there's certain things that people believe and there's certain things that people think, and so this is a way to get some really good, groundbreaking, I don't know if it's groundbreaking, but get some scientific data to kind of support what that is. But the first question I have is, what are some things that you guys would like to get out of coming here today besides the CEU? And maybe not being at work. I'm a therapist. I can get people to talk. So, yes, ma'am.
Well, I remember when I was in the field 25 years ago, and it was a treatment center, and if somebody relapsed, it was, the end of the world. Which I thought, this is so stupid. Like even I knew, I was just in training, that this is part of the disease, but they kind of really shame the person. And then I'm thinking, you do that, they might not come back. So when did they start changing? I mean, I now know that it is considered part of the disease, but how could they have been so cruel?
Well, I can't answer that question because I think if I could, I probably wouldn't be here. But relapse doesn't have to be part of recovery. And I think a lot of people make that mistake of saying, well, that's just part of it. It doesn't have to be. It really is a learning process. Yes, ma'am.
One of the things that I would like to learn is to find that line. Because, where I work, they kind of said, okay, well, it used to be an all or nothing. You relapse, you're gone. And now it's come a case-to-case basis. But we have a code of conduct, and our code of conduct says, this time you may be discharged, or this might be the sanction, to try and corral you back into being in a safe zone.
Right.
But our people have taken that as allowance. But I've got 2 more times to relapse before you put me out.
Right.
So trying to find that balance of, hey, this is not an expected behavior, this is not a tolerated behavior, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be discharged from the program, but you don't get 2 freebies.
Right. A lot of that is education for the client in terms of where are they, what are they thinking. And there are people that come to treatment. And when I worked here in the Farley program, I worked with the professionals. And there's some people that just want to check a box. And they're compliant, meaning they're doing the stuff they're supposed to do. But there hasn't been that physical, mental, and spiritual change. And so until that really happens, some people are going to still think that way. So we're going to go ahead and get into this. So one of the questions I always like to ask people is, what are your personal biases against people who have addiction or mental illness? And the reason I ask that question is because I don't care what job you have, if you work with people who have an addiction, there is some personal bias. And the best supervision advice I ever got is you have to talk about it with your supervisor or with somebody that you trust. So I'm throwing that out. What are your personal biases against people who have an addiction or mental illness? We are all saints in here apparently because no one has a comment. But, yes ma'am.
I think you look at 2 different things. If you're a clinician and you work with substance abuse and you have a client. But then if you're a clinician working with substance abuse and you have a family member who is addicted to whatever, then trying to keep those processes separated.
Right, but there's still a bias that's there regardless of who you work with. I mean, whether it's, I'll get to you, hang on one second, whether it is a family member or not, and yes, we respond differently as clinicians or people in the field versus if it's somebody we love, absolutely we respond differently, but that bias can still exist. So that's why it's always good to check out that bias because that will impact how you work with people, how you talk to people, who you refer people to. I went to MCV. Hang on one second. I got one lady in the back too. I went to MCV to talk about methadone treatment. I used to be the director of a facility that had methadone treatment. And I asked this question, and this one guy raised his hand, and he said, I don't like people who use heroin. I think they're weak. And I said, what's your role here? He goes, I refer people to treatment. And his supervisor was sitting in front of him. I mean, kudos to him for being honest and saying that, but I mean, that's something that people have to talk about. Yes, ma'am.
What my
Can you speak up a little bit, please?
What the struggle is as to why they can't stop using.
Why they can't stop using?
As they get older, why can't they, a 70-year-old still use drugs?
That's an OG right there. You know, that's what that is. That's just an OG that's used to living that way, right? And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about that. And that's a great question because I think a lot of people look at why can't they just stop using? Yes, ma'am. Heck yeah, I'm not cussing today. Heck yeah, right? So it's always good to know what your personal bias is. Mine was I struggled working with women who were pregnant and who were still using. And, you know, what I had to work through was they have the same disease that the person that's not pregnant has. So why would their pregnancy change anything? Some women don't use when they're pregnant and some do. And so I had to check that in myself because where I used to work, I would work with pregnant women who were on heroin who would come in and use methadone. Methadone is safe for pregnant women to take. But I still had to check myself to see if I was doing what I needed to do right by the client. So this is from a study done in '98, and it talks about holding an implicit bias towards a particular social group can determine how you treat an individual from that group. They affect behavior, thought, society, including classroom, workplaces, and the legal society. And I'm sure we see that in playing out on the news, social media, etc. So the next thing we're going to talk about is what is relapse? That is like the $1 million question. Anybody ever heard of Terrence Gorski? He is, okay, so he wrote this book with Stephen Grinstead. This is the Relapse Prevention Therapy Workbook. I highly, highly recommend that you get it and take a look at it because it is amazing. I was fortunate enough when I was working here to go to a training where Gorski was, and I had a training by him, and we went through this book, and it was completely phenomenal. So relapse is the process of becoming dysfunctional in recovery. So that implies someone has been sober. They are not using anything mood-altering from the neck up, even if the doctor gives it to them. They're not using it. And then it takes people from stability through various stages of dysfunction and then back to using or to another drug of choice. So a lot of people say, well, I just have a problem with alcohol. I can still do a little blow every now and then. No is the answer, right? No. Okay. There are a series of behaviors, thoughts, and actions that happen. Relapse can take a month, a day, a week, a year. And picking up the drug is the last thing that happens in the relapse process. The very last thing that happens. It is not the first. So with those clients, this lady right here in the white, I think you were talking about the relapse and like what happens. Part of it is helping somebody understand what their triggers are, what their cravings are. When I worked here, clients would say, well, I can't tell you about my cravings because that means you're going to make me stay here longer, which is completely ludicrous because this is an addiction, it's a disease. And we're going to go over the disease model, but there are people that really believe that. That wasn't true, but if you can't talk about your cravings, then why go to treatment? I mean, that's where you need to learn how to talk about that. So we're going to go through behaviors, thoughts, and then all of this came from Gorski's workbook that I have. Relapse warning signs are the experiences recovering people have that create unnecessary pain, problems, and cravings, setting them to reactivate their addiction. And a lot of people that relapse are like, I never wanted to do this. I never planned to do this. So conversely, what is addiction? So one study by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which is NIDA, and all this information you can find online. NIDA determined that a person's health is the result of interactions between genes and environment. So this is kind of the genetically predisposed and the environment. You combine those together. Sometimes you get an alcoholic and addict and sometimes you don't. Social influences can infect or enhance the risk of addiction, and genetics can also play a part. So I worked, the treatment center I just left, we had an adolescent treatment program there, and there was a girl who was in foster care, and she had come to group because she couldn't keep a job because she worked at Hardee's and kept going out in the back and smoking weed all the time. And so they're like, well, I think she probably needs treatment. Totally agree. She's 15. And so when I was doing her assessment, I asked her, when was the first time you ever used any substances? And she said, oh, I was 10. I used cocaine because my parents always had it on the coffee table. And while that might not always be the situation for everybody, sometimes it's about access. Nurses that use drugs, they divert because why? They have keys to the candy store. It's harder to do it now with all of the Pixis and all the different systems. It might be harder to do, but it still happens, right? There's some nurses that choose alcohol because they think alcohol isn't going to get me in trouble at work because I'm not going to be diverting anything. But when your disease progresses and you show up at work drunk, guess what happens? Your addiction has impacted your work. Okay, so this is the moral versus the disease model. And the reason I put this up here is because there are a lot of people that believe some of these, they believe all of them, but this belief system impacts how you treat clients, okay? So the moral aspect is on the left, disease is on the right. Moral aspect says it's good or bad, right or wrong. There are a lot of black and whites. You know, either you did or you didn't. We all know speeding is illegal, and how many of you sped coming here today? Right? I use my cruise control because, I drive a Prius, I can only go but so fast. But still, I use, because I know how I can drive sometimes, right? So the mindset of people who believe in the moral concept, if it's wrong, just don't do it. And I can tell you, if it were that easy, this place wouldn't be here. I would have a job. AA wouldn't need to be around. That's how that would be. You were raised better than that, which is a shaming statement. It's the you thing, you know, where you shake your finger. It goes against our religious beliefs. And there's some religions that do have that sense of where you don't drink or don't take intoxicants. And so that's valid if that's something that you believe. And so a lot of people struggle with that. I was working with a gentleman who went to Liberty University Law School, and they sign something that says they can't drink at all while they're there. Period, in school. It doesn't matter if you're on campus or not. And someone saw him drinking at a restaurant, and the dean called where I work. I'm the deputy clinical director for Judges and Lawyer Assistance Program. They called us. So I wonder which one they believe in. And that's nothing against Liberty at all, but it just speaks to where they choose to go to school. It's a matter of willpower. So the example I always give is, anybody in this room had diarrhea? Have you tried to will it away? Have you tried to act like it's not going to happen? Have you tried to pretend? Have you tried to take medications to make sure that doesn't happen? Right? So that's a great example of willpower. That makes about as much sense as telling an addict in active addiction, just use your willpower and not use. That was what the DARE program was based on, and it flopped horribly. You just need a man, a woman who can handle you. That's it. Well, that is. I agree. That's abusive. Sometimes it's very cultural, depending on where you live, depending on your nationality. It's very cultural. You need to be married by a certain age. You don't need to work, or you need to work. Those are all external things. My favorite one is, if you love me enough, fill in the blank. And Tina Turner said, love's got nothing to do with it. So, so the disease model, you can't control it, you can't cure it, and you cannot fix it. And there are lots of families that I work with that think they can do all of those things. And they drive themselves into the ground. Because think about when you want to make a change in your life, how hard that is to do that. And yet you're going to do that to another human being. So the disease model is there's specific symptoms that are present for use, depending on the substance you're using. It is chronic and progressive. There are people that start using at 25 and they might stop using at 30, and that disease has progressed to the point that something bad enough has happened for them to say, I can't use anymore, I need to come to treatment, I'm having physical problems, they overdose, etc. Physical problems, mental health problems are made worse by use. There are a lot of people who have depression, anxiety disorder, bipolar disorder is the most common co-occurring disorder in addiction, because it's like they have their own little chemistry experiment going on in their brain. If they're too high, they use something to bring them down. If they're too low, they use something to bring them up. And bipolar disorder and addiction are two separate brain disorders that coexist in the same person. There's ongoing behavior issues even when the person is not using. And that is key, because recovery talks about behaving, acting, and feeling different. That's a dry drunk that's not drinking or using, but they act the same. They metabolize substances differently in the body than someone who is not genetically predisposed. So for example, people in recovery need to tell their treatment professionals, like their dentists, doctors, whoever, that they're in recovery, because if you go in for a dental procedure to have a cavity filled, you will have to have more Novocaine than the average bear, because your tolerance doesn't go anywhere when you stop using. Okay? Tolerance and withdrawal symptoms, some are life-threatening if not addressed by medical intervention. So the withdrawal symptoms for alcohol are different than are for cocaine, than are different for benda. So if you're using all of those things, it's really fun to watch somebody detox. And they're pretty miserable. Okay, so has anyone seen this? Stages of Change by Prochaska and DiClemente. They're pretty famous. They originally started doing this for smoking cessation, but you can really apply this to any stage of your life: addiction, changing jobs, getting married, if you're that rigid. But so the pre-contemplation stage is there's no problem. These are the clients that come in, they do an evaluation, they've had 3 DUIs, their families kicked them out, and they say, you know, they're the one that really has the issue, I'm fine. It was just a misunderstanding, the cop had it out for me. They don't know what they're talking about. The contemplation stage is, well, maybe there's something going on. There's a lot of ambivalence. And there's some people in treatment that go between pre-contemplation and contemplation and maybe go into some determination where they're making the changes. Because this is a life change for someone. What is the one thing you all like to do that makes you feel better? That you're willing to share. Let me preface that.
I like to sleep.
You like to sleep, okay. You paint. Eat ice cream. Walk. Huh? Read. I'm loving your hair, by the way. You're welcome. Anybody else? Exercise. Shopping, anybody? Right. That can get you in trouble, but. So what would you do if I said you can't paint anymore because that is detrimental to your health and I'm worried that you might die? You'd ignore me, right? You kill somebody. You're sleeping too much. You can't sleep that much. You can't shop anymore. You can't do this anymore. So that is what people hear when they're in active addiction and they come into treatment. What do you mean I can't ever use again? I had this one nurse who was I'm like 5'10". She was literally like this tall. And she came in. She was taking enough Xanax to kill about 5 people. And we were in our large community group, which was in that big group room right there. And we started talking about cross-addiction, talking about alcohol, and I said the same thing. She stood up, and she was like this far from me. You can't, and she starts doing this. You can't tell me I can't have a glass of wine. I said, I didn't tell you couldn't have a glass of wine. I said, it's probably not a good idea, and we might need to talk about why you're reacting so strongly to this. But so a lot of people in treatment really do struggle with the first 3 stages, and they can go back and forth. They can exit and enter at any stage. And so what happens with families is when the person finally says, you're right, I have a problem, I need to stop using, the family's like, oh, thank God it's fixed. They're done. And then they start behaving in a way that seems like they're using. And then the family jumps on them. And then the addict eventually says, what? Might as well, if you think I'm using, I might as well use, right? So the action phase is where they take the steps they need to take. They might change their phone number. They might block certain numbers. They might move. And sometimes that can be called a geographical location. But they might go to treatment away from where they live. And I always suggest people go to treatment away, away. Because if you live in Richmond and come here for treatment, and I'm not discouraging that because a lot of people do, I've seen clients have a much harder time because they're so close to home. It's much more difficult for them. And there's the little relapse, the bad little word, but relapse teaches us something. So people can have a relapse if they've had a period of time in recovery where they're not using, maybe they're going to meetings, and they relapse, meaning they use a substance. So I had a friend of mine who's like, well, I took a Percocet. Is that a relapse? I'm like, well, was it prescribed to you? Like, did it have your name on the bottle? No. Yeah, it's a relapse. You didn't like how you felt and you took something to make you feel better. That's a relapse, okay? And she was engaging in some other behaviors that were very indicative of when she was using. And then the fact that she relapsed, you could just kind of see that whole process. And the maintenance phase is really where you're doing everything you need to do on a daily basis for your recovery. Now, some people get sober by not going to 12-step programs. Some of them go to church. Some of them do smart recovery. Some of them do other things. So it's really about, A is not the only way to get sober. I think it works really well, but I've known clients and that doesn't work for them. And so really maintenance is what are you doing on a daily basis to help you physically, mentally, spiritually stay sober. And so you can enter and leave at any time during that process. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. So this is a list of relapsive or using behaviors. So the first one is being selfish or dishonest. And that takes some time to go away, to be honest with you, because there's the post-acute withdrawal syndrome, which Gorski talks about too, which is called PAWS, P-A-W-S. And that is where it takes 18 to 24 months for your brain to heal from the substances that are using. So that can be very difficult for people. There's a whole cluster of symptoms that comes with that. It can look like they're very clumsy physically. When I worked here, people in detox would be like, I want to go play volleyball, and we would all laugh. Like that is not going to work for you to go play volleyball because you can barely get out of bed and walk down the hall. So chasing after a ball is probably not the best thing to do. Secretive behaviors or lying. Some people in recovery will lie even when the truth serves them better, and this baffles earth people, people who don't have a disease, that's what I call them, earth people, yes. Because it's like, why wouldn't you just tell the truth? Well, when you've lived your entire life having to figure out how to be deceitful and how to lie, it's very scary to be honest. And quite frankly, how many of you have been in a situation where you know you've made a mistake and your first motive, I don't want to be honest with this. I'm not going to like the consequences that I'm going to have. It's all about me and my needs or wants. Addiction is very selfish. It robs people of a life. It robs families of a life with them, and they're very selfish. People in active addiction will miss very important events. They will lose jobs. They will miss the birth of a child. They will miss birthdays. They will miss a lot of things. And so if you start seeing some of this in recovery, a lot of people get really concerned that something's going to happen. And I've heard families say, well, you got sober, but now you go to all those meetings, you might as well just use. I've had people tell them that. Distancing from family or anyone who challenges their substance use. Have you had that happen? Right? So it could be the dude that relapses and comes back into treatment, and a therapist starts talking about, so tell me what happened. Why did you tell me what led you to use? And they could, start ripping one about the treatment center. It's not about the treatment center. It's not about the therapist. It's not about any of that stuff. But they're going to do that as a way to be distracted to you. Financial problems, job loss, that can happen. Legal problems, including jail. Engaging in dangerous behaviors, putting self and others at risk. And that could be driving while intoxicated, driving while high, being in places at night that they probably shouldn't be to score or to do other things. Angry outbursts, undefinable fears. And that's probably the scariest one when you have these undefinable fears of, I don't know why I'm afraid, I just am. Because they can't figure out why they're afraid. So when you ask them, it agitates them because they can't figure it out. That's like, how many of you like calculus? I don't either. So if someone said you need to figure this problem out, I would really not be very pleasant about it probably. So some of the thoughts that these people, that addicts have is, no one understands me, I'm different. How would I know if I have a problem? I'm too smart to be an addict, I know better. That happens a lot with pedestal professionals that have a license. I got through graduate school, I have a PhD, I have this, and my response was, and yet you're still here. So that doesn't prevent people from having an addiction, or you just don't get it. Or people are people pleasers, and they say things that other people want to hear to get them off their back. And I know everybody has had the experience of doing that. You're on my back yapping about something, and yep, I did it. And just move on. So conversely, look at the recovery-related behaviors. The focus is very, very different. In active addiction, it's all about me. It's all about what I want. It's all about what I need. It's not about what other people need. It's a very isolative addiction. It isolates people. So there are ways that you can be isolated and be. Have y'all ever felt lonely in a crowded room? I heard some. Okay, so imagine and maybe you do feel that way all the time. So what happens is it's very, very isolative for people who are in active addiction. And so the opposite of that is connection, right? You connect with other people, and that is the total opposite of active addiction is connection. It's about connecting, and that's how we tell people, go to meetings, get a sponsor, be around people who are sober. My mom used to say, you're going to get fleas if you lay with a dog. So what that means in Southern language is if you don't want to get fleas, you don't want to lay around with dogs. So if you want to be sober, you don't hang out with people that are still using, right? Having fun. One of the best things I ever saw is when people who first get sober go and have fun and they are sober. It is life-changing for them to have that experience of being able to have fun. And that can happen in treatment when they go bowling or when they are laughing, sitting down at a meal and they're laughing with people. That was one of the best things that I love to see because they don't know how to have fun because their entire life is how am I going to use, when am I going to use, where am I going to get it, what lie am I going to tell, etc. So no substances that alter them from the neck up. So that means that you talk to your professionals, let them know that you're in recovery. You also don't take other people's medication. Like, if I have a headache, I'm not going to take a Darvocet. I'm going to actually take Advil. Attending 12-step meetings or some other form of support groups. That is another way that people can learn how to be helpful. Because in active addiction, people don't feel like they want them around because they usually don't. But when you start going to meetings, you start realizing people ask where I am if I'm not here. Like nobody's ever done that in a long time. Normally they're glad I'm not around. So they're asking, where am I? They're asking, can you help me do fill in the blank? Or can you make coffee for the meeting? Or I'm going to give you a key to the church so you can open up. And a lot of times that key, they don't even have a key to their own parents' house. And these people are giving them a key to a church to open up. So those are huge things that can help people in recovery. And you're not going to get it unless you actually go to a meeting. Giving back, that's something that AA talks about, is you give freely you give back freely what was given to you. So that means you help another person. In active addiction, you're not helping anybody. It's I'm going to get mine, screw you, whatever. Recovery is just the opposite of that. Sometimes seeking therapy is what can be helpful. When I was working actively in treatment, a lot of clients would need additional therapy. People that are brand new in treatment don't need to have that wound opened when they were molested when they were 12 and they've been sober 2 weeks because they do not have the skills to manage those feelings. So part of it is learning at what stage do I refer people? At what stage do I get them to get extra help? Physical activity, eating healthy, and actually sleeping. That is one of the biggest things that is discussed is sleep hygiene. How many of you function really well on not a lot of sleep? Because there's some people that can do that. I am not one of them, but there's some people that can do that, right? How many of you know how much sleep you need? Okay, I know exactly how much sleep I need in order to kind of be able to get up and function the next day, right? So think about active addiction. A lot of times people use to help them fall asleep. I love when people say, well, I don't ever pass out. Well, do you consciously go to sleep after you've had a 12-pack or a case? Probably not. Their mood improves, right? So they're more pleasant to be around. You can actually have a conversation with them. They're more helpful. They're more engaged. They take more responsibility in their life, which some family members don't like this because the way the family system is, if I'm married to someone that's an alcoholic and I'm used to being the martyr and I'm used to doing everything and all of a sudden you get sober, thank you for letting me pick on you. You get sober and you start saying, I'll go pick the kids up from daycare or let me go to the grocery store for you. That other person's going to get pissed. Like, why are you all of a sudden doing that now? Because they don't know how to define their role outside of that addictive relationship. Ending toxic relationships, including drug dealers. That's a toxic relationship. I've had people tell me my drug dealer has my work phone and they'll call me and say, hey, how you doing? You need anything? Haven't heard from you in a while. My first thing is how they get your work number. But people that don't support their recovery, and that can be friends, that can be family, that can be learning how to set really healthy boundaries for people that don't support your recovery. Does anybody have any questions about this? All right, so this is where we're going to start talking about Terrence Gorski. A lot of people said they knew who he was, right? Because if you don't, we're going to get real familiar. All right, so Gorski is inevitably thought of with relapse prevention. His name just kind of goes with it. He started developing this in 1972, and he did all the work and the research on his own. He actually has a treatment center in Florida, and he's pretty amazing to work with. And so part of it is he was really the first one to talk about exploring triggers, because we have 5 senses, so we have 5 ways to be triggered. And it can be something really positive. How many of you, when you smell something, you feel really happy? How many of you smell something and get really irritated? Like the ex-boyfriend's cologne? I don't know. So when I was in college, I had never been away from home before, and I went to school about 3.5, 4 hours away. And I was in a philosophy class, and I always couldn't figure out why I felt so comfortable in that class. Like there was a sense of peace when I was there. And I couldn't figure it out. Well, the woman sitting behind me smelled like a mixture of perfume and cigarettes. I know, weird, but that's what my mom smelled like. And that's what made me feel comfortable. And it took me like half a semester to get that, you know? So they can be good and they can be not so good. And so an addict struggles with the same thing. They're good memories they have. Addiction, like substance use makes them happy for a while until it doesn't, right? So the one thing he teaches clients is how do you interrupt that relapse process? And that's the power that he can give people if you really help clients to understand that. And picking up the substance is the last thing that happens. I can't drive that home enough. That is the very last thing that happens. So he talks about these relapse warning signs. So there's a downward cycle that happens whenever people start to relapse. So it's the difficulty coping with stress. Stress is the #1 trigger. It is the #1 relapse. Because if you start using when you were 12 and you get sober when you're 30 or 40 or whatever, you stop growing emotionally when you first start using. So when you get sober at whatever age you are, that's the age you are when you get sober. You know, so emotionally you might be 12, but you're really 35, right? But you're supposed to function like a normal 35-year-old and handle things and do things and all that kind of stuff. And so sometimes it's like putting a cork in a bottle. I mean, no pun intended. But what happens is when that is released, there's this flood or tsunami of feelings that happen, and they have no way of managing that. Absolutely none. Because it's like they missed that part of growing up. So that's what Gorski talks about. Then you can see how their belief system comes into play and it goes into their thinking. So how many of you have been in a situation where maybe there's a sensitive subject that you are dealing with, or maybe there's something you got personally, and somebody says something and you hear it and like they're attacking you, or you hear it like it's something that's negative. How many of you go check that out with that person and say, what I heard you say was this, and I felt this?
Every time or sometimes?
Well, I mean, nobody's perfect. But the point to this is that when you have that situation happen and you have all these negative feelings, automatically they're an SOB and you're going to roll over them with your car when you leave in the parking lot. But the difference is you're carrying all this negativity around and you don't have all the data. So you go to that person and say, you know what, when we were in that meeting, you said blah, 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 and that made me really angry and upset. Is that what you meant to say? And that person either says, yeah, because I thought you made a really dumb comment or whatever, or the person says, that's not what I meant. I'm really sorry. What I meant was this. And then those feelings that you have go away. There's no need to hold them anymore, right? So that's a good communication tool that if there's no other takeaway, you can do that. So there are things that people believe about themselves. I'm not worthy of recovery. I had a client yesterday that said, I just don't feel like I deserve to be sober. They don't feel like they deserve to be happy. So if you have thoughts, your behavior follows. So if these thoughts are rolling around in their head and they are not being discussed, it's like putting Miracle Grow on that stuff, right? So a lot of times rationalization comes out too. I'm only smoking weed. How many of y'all heard that? It's not that big. I mean, it's going to be legal. Well, it's not. I had a client tell me one time, weed is legal. I said, not in Virginia. She goes, well, it's legal in Colorado. I said, we're not in Colorado.
Alcohol's legal.
Right. But that didn't matter to her. Only weed mattered to her, right? Or my favorite is I haven't overdosed yet. Yet is an acronym for you're eligible to, right? I can use one more time. I can have one more beer. I can do one more thing and drink like a normal person. My comment is if you could drink like a normal person, we would not be having this discussion. You wouldn't be in treatment. you wouldn't be here, etc. So those are some of the things that can come back after people have been sober. Well, I've never tried cough syrup before. I had a client tell me that. He went out and drank an entire bottle of Delsum. And I saw him and I said, well, did you like it? And he's like, I feel so bad. Okay, well, maybe you needed to do that. I wasn't quite that brash, but that was kind of the, anyway. So the relapse cycle, once you have the thoughts and beliefs that happen, the cravings are happening. So think about this as a circle. The person often has been hanging out with using friends. So what ends up happening is they start having the thoughts. Then they start having these cravings about, yeah, it's football season. I wouldn't mind having a beer. And the next thing you know, they're in the bar just seeing what's happening. Well, everybody knows what happens at a bar. Like, do you go by your drug dealer's house and say, how's business? Like, how are things going? And so then they start spending more time with their using friends than their sober friends. So it might look like they stop going to meetings, they stop talking to their sponsor, they're not spending time with family anymore. So you can see this whole progress happening. Old thought patterns start coming back. Weed never gave me a problem. I never had an issue with this. Oh, there's this ketamine that's coming out. Maybe I should try this, etc. External motivations go away. So external motivations are things outside us, like your mom, your dad, your spouse, the court, whatever. The internal motivation is a true desire to change. And so they start to question that. They start to question, do I really have a problem? My mom's always been on my back. She's so uptight. She's never done drugs before. What does she know? So then those self-defeating thoughts come back that we talked about. I'm not good enough. What's the point? I'm going to die at some point. I might as well try to control when I die. Then they start making bad decisions, whether that is not sleeping, staying up all night playing video games. I had a client who'd been sober almost 4 years. The doctor had given him a medication to help him sleep. It was Remeron. He's also bipolar. He comes in to see me looking like he was dragged from under a truck. And I'm like, are you using? He's like, why do you ask? And I said, because you look like you're using. You look high. He was devastated. But after I talked to him for a while, he was getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to play video games to have me time. I said, what do you do that you're so busy that you can't do this when you get home at night? Well, I'm not taking my medication because that prevents me from getting up to play video games. Oh, and I really feel like I did when I was using. So we had a very long conversation about that. And all of that can lead to relapse. So this guy, I had a conversation with him. I talked to a psychiatrist. He got back in to see the psychiatrist, and he started taking the medication he needed to take. And I had a conversation with him yesterday, and he sounds like he always did. And it was that slippery slope that could happen, because this guy's good at making everybody think he's okay. And that's the thing. People can say whatever they want, but watch what they do. If you're sober, you will have sober behaviors. You're not going to go hang out with a dope man. You're not going to go hang out with that chick that you used to use with all the time. You're not going to spend time with them. So look at the behaviors that they engage in. Kevin McCauley did 2 really good videos. One of them is Memo to Self, and the other one is Pleasure Unwoven. Pleasure Unwoven is his first one. Memo to Self is the second one, where he talks a lot about his journey to recovery. You can Google these. You can YouTube them. I strongly recommend you just Google Kevin McCauley and not Pleasure Unwoven, because you will get really weird stuff. But what he talks about is addiction is not the result of one decision, but several little decisions. Conversely, recovery is exactly the same way. It's exactly the same. Does anybody have any questions before we get into this? About anything? Nothing. Okay. All right. So the book that I showed you, the Relapse Prevention Therapy Workbook, a lot of this stuff comes from this. So he has the CNAPS program, and these are relapse prevention basic principles. And he talks about a lot of the stuff that I just shared. One of them is self-regulation. So people in active addiction don't know how to self-regulate. That's like a 2-year-old. They don't know how to self-regulate, right? That is a skill you have to learn. And how do you learn how to self-regulate?
I have a question, just in general. How does harm, like if you're going to go from a harm reduction approach, integrate with like relapse prevention? Because I could see that being a very like slippery slope.
It is. When I worked in methadone treatment, a lot of people would stop using heroin, but they would continue to smoke weed. And so for them, that was their harm reduction model because they would smoke weed. They did not want to be in recovery, but they also knew they couldn't use heroin because of all these negative things that happen. So that's where we would work on that and use that and have an open conversation about, have you thought about stopping weed? And the answer's always been no. Most of the time it was no. So that's where in a setting like that you can do that, but it's very hard in a treatment facility like this to talk about harm reduction because, you know, if you're an alcoholic and you tell me I can smoke weed a little bit, why am I here? What's the point, right? So I don't know if that answered your question. I'm trying to keep my personal opinion out of it. So part of self-regulation, how do you learn to self-regulate? Anyone? Well, it's a process, right? She said, I'll let you know when I get there. It's a process, right? So, but where do we start to learn how to do this? Yes?
We start having negative consequences.
Right. So if you're little, like my mother would come and yell, because I'm 54, so there was no cell phone. She would yell out the front door my name. And if I heard her yelling my name and it was dark, I was going to be in trouble because I had to be home before it got dark. I didn't have a watch. You know what it is like when it starts to get dark outside, right? That was a spoken rule. You have to be home by dark because that's when we're going to eat, right? So I learned how to self-regulate by figuring that out. So part of it too can be how many of you are like, I'm going to go to the gym. I heard somebody talking about that earlier. I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to do this, but I'm really tired. I don't feel like going. I don't really want to. Well, I don't like the workout today. I'm not going to go. Or I'll just go walk, you know? So there are all these kinds of things that come into play. So we have to learn to self-regulate or else we wouldn't have jobs, we wouldn't have careers, we wouldn't have families. We would not be able to pass that on to our children about that delayed gratification and all of those things. So part of what Gorski talks about is learning how to self-regulate for physical, psychological, and social stabilization, right? So it might be 2 o'clock and I might want to leave work because I'm really fried. You know, I've been working on something, I'm just done, or maybe I'm really tired. So what do you do instead of saying I'm going to leave and take PTO every time you feel like doing that? Caffeine is one. Diet Coke is another. Walking outside. Looking out a window. There are all kinds of things you can do to kind of help your brain reset to do what you need to do. Well, I don't know if you can do that at work. I can't do that at work. But the second principle is integration, which is about self-assessment. So part of that is if I really feel like I need to go to a meeting and I'm really struggling, my second principle is how do I do that? Maybe I need to call my sponsor. Maybe I need to call somebody and say, you know, I'm really struggling. I need to go to a meeting. Will you go with me or will you meet me there? The third principle is understanding relapse education. So there's always a process. This disease is ongoing. Nobody's ever cured from it. They're just not. They're never cured from it. So that question you asked about why can't they just stop? Because it's a daily struggle. It really is a daily struggle. Sometimes, some days are easier than others. If you implement a lot of what Gorski's talking about and you learn and you go through the process of recovery, there are days that do get easier where you don't think about drinking. You don't want to drink. You don't want to go to the bar. You'd rather go to a meeting or hang out with your girlfriend or do whatever, right? So part of it is, how do I know my relapse warning signs? And he talks a lot about that. And when I was in graduate school, I would look at this stuff and it like really irritated me because it was so tedious. But what I didn't know is that's how addiction is. When you go to, anybody here go to AA meetings? I'm just going to raise my hand. I'm in recovery. I go, okay, so they read the same thing over and over again in the beginning, right? Why do you think they do that? Takes a while to get it, right? So part of it is knowing what your relapse triggers are, understanding all of those. So that part is the relapse part. Fifth principle, coping skills. Right? Coping skills when they were using was what? Using with a period, right? So they have to learn, what can I do when I feel like I have a craving? What can I do when I get stressed out? How do I determine how I feel? There's a book by T.N. Dayton, T-I-A-N, Dayton, D-A-Y-T-O-N, Trauma and Addiction. It's an amazing book that I've used when I worked here, I've used with my clients after they've been sober for a while, because she talks about understanding feelings and being able to label them and identify them. And she talks a lot about setting really healthy boundaries. Because a lot of times people in addiction, when they get sober, they have so much guilt and shame, they can let people use them as a doormat and let people say whatever they want to say to them, which isn't healthy. You know, I have watched family members roll over them like a doormat because they're so angry at them. And my comment to them is, do you have a therapist you can go talk to? Because that's not his job to figure out your crap. Because it's not, right? So, I lost my train of thought. So we'll just go on to the next one. I don't know where it went. A recovery plan. A recovery plan is, who do I have in my network that can call me on my stuff? In the thing that Kevin McCauley did, Memo to Self, they talk about this with where he went to treatment, the guy that was the medical director. And this guy, he said, if you give the people permission to call you out, it'll piss you off, but you'll let them do it. If you do not give them permission, it's like Armageddon. Okay, so part of it is the recovery plan is that person who's in recovery has to have a person or people that they know they can call out, that can call them out on their stuff, like a sponsor or a best friend. And it's not done in a shaming way. It's like, I haven't seen you go to a meeting in a week, dude, what's going on? You know? And if you give them permission to do that, they might get pissed off with, I've been really busy, but then they might start talking about something else. So that's part of that recovery plan, of knowing where that person's going to go. So it's really important in early recovery. I'm having like a flashback seeing you here. Part of it is like, is understanding what is my plan. So when you're in treatment, they talk about a recovery plan. When you step down to intensive outpatient or partial, they talk about a recovery plan of what do you need to do to stay sober? Who do you need to have in your network that's going to help you? The seventh principle of awareness is about inventory training. Now, there's taken an inventory, part of that's in work and step work, but part of it is what's my stuff and what's your stuff. My side of the street's here, your side of the street is there. The two aren't going to mix. So part of that is understanding that. The eighth one is the involvement of significant others. We've already talked about that. And then the last one is maintenance, which is about that comprehensive recovery plan. So the things that people do early in their recovery are not things they're going to do 10 years later, because you evolve and grow and change. Don Coyes is Native American. He's also been sober like 34. Isn't he amazing? So he talks about, YouTube him, is it C-O-Y-I-S or C-O-8? I knew there was an H in there. Yes, but there's one that he talks about the seasons, where you go through the seasons in recovery, and it is fascinating to talk about that, because there are 4 seasons a year, right? Well, people in recovery go through 1 season a year. So the first 4 years of your recovery, winter, summer, spring, fall. And so there are different things that happen in the season. So in the wintertime, what do people do? What do animals do in the winter? They hibernate, they draw in, they get rid of things they don't need. So at certain stages of your recovery, you're going to do that. And a lot of times people feel like, I'm doing this wrong. I should be farther along. I had somebody I was in a meeting with that made the same comment, I should be farther along because I've been sober X amount of time. And that is so dangerous for people to say, because it implies they're doing it wrong, right? So that's that comprehensive stuff. Don Coyes is amazing. I had to listen to it a few times, but he's really good. And that's something you can pull up and watch with your clients, sit in your office. I mean, that is like the can you spell this last?
C-O-Y-H-I-S.
C-O-Y-H-I-S. First name Don. He talks about it's the seasons. And he had been sober, I don't know, I think like into double digits when he went to an elder in his community, and this elder told him about this. So to me, that's the process of always learning. As a clinician, if I start thinking I know everything, then I probably don't need to be doing this anymore. So, yes, ma'am.
The Red Road to Recovery, which espouses the same philosophy.
Okay, Red Road to Recovery. So part of it too, I think the responsibility we have as clinicians and helpers is understanding what's out there and how we can best reach our clients. Anybody else have any comments about anything? Okay. Yes.
One, and maybe you're going to shed light on this later, but I know for a lot of our people, when they get into recovery, the whole changing people, places, and things, the people are the hardest part because there's this deep threat of loneliness, and and having to deal with self.
Yeah.
So that loneliness and boredom
Yeah.
is just such a dangerous combination.
It is. It is.
And I can't help them make friends for themselves. So I'm hoping maybe you'll touch on
Well,
that.
part of it too is really having a conversation with them about what is it so hard about letting these people go? Like what is it about that? Because I think we have to have that honest discussion with them and give them a space to talk about. We always used together and we always had fun, and I've known him my whole life. I'm just not ready to give that up yet. Yes, ma'am.
Wouldn't a lot of that just be basic lack of trust? I mean,
Well, they trust those addicts better than they trust you.
well, that's what I'm saying, so that's why it's so
Yeah.
hard to give it up, because they are familiar with that. And so I would think that some people do need some serious therapy to go back to trust issues, because the addiction is what keeps them safe. That's the only thing they can.
Well, right, that is, but you can't like break that scab open if it's too soon in recovery because they don't have the skills to come out with that. There's things that I had a client of mine who he was in and out of IOP and treatment, and he came back in and he sat down and started talking to me, and he said, Barbara, I was in residential, and he goes, I talked to them about something I've never told you. And I don't ever know what to expect when they say that. And I said, what happened? And he said, I lost a child. And every year I struggle with being sober during that time because I never got to see him after he died. I never had that closure. And this man was in his 50s. Never talked about it before, ever. Never talked about it before. So I can't talk to him about trusting people when the people that he was supposed to trust with his baby didn't give him and his wife that closure. And that's who he entrusted to do that to. So what I can do is provide a safe space to talk about that and talk about, you don't want to lead in with like, well, it sounds like you don't trust people. You want to ask them why, tell me why it is it's so hard for you. You need to hear their words about why it's so hard for them, because we can suppose all day long, but until we hear it from our clients, we don't know. So ask them what is hard about that. Also go into meetings with people they know. So if you have two clients that you know are going to meetings and they know each other, say go to a meeting together. When I did IOP, there was a noon meeting people wanted to go to. I let them leave 10 minutes early and go to a damn meeting. Sorry. Because that's how they connect with people, because they're not going to be in IOP forever. They're not going to be in therapy forever. They have to learn how to exist and how to function without being in this level of therapy or IOP or whatever. They have to learn how to do that. So if we engage in a dialogue with tell me why you feel that way or tell me why that's hard for you, we are going to understand our client better, and then we can help them. Because we can have, you can have a beautiful treatment plan. If the client doesn't want to do it or relate to it, it's a waste. So why not have that conversation with them and give them that ability to talk about it? Any other questions about anything? Yes.
Comment. I always thought of relapse in relation to drugs and alcohol, but today you're talking about, which makes you realize it applies to any negative behavior.
Yes.
Affairs, anger,
Yes.
eating disorders.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Sexually acting out, shopping too much, gambling is one. Well, I'm not using. But you have all the same issues you did when you were using, but you're just gambling, right? So behaviors is like one of the first things that you notice. That's why that client that came in, it looked like he had come from underneath the truck. That's why I said, are you using? Because he looked like it, and he was acting like it. Okay, some people believe that once you stop using substances, this is what happens. It's amazing. It's wonderful. Everybody runs on the beach. It's a myth. That's not what happens. So we have to be careful not to have these expectations placed upon our clients or placed upon family members, right? Because if you love somebody, you're scared, you don't want them to die. And if you see the little bit of change, you think, oh my God, they're cured forever. And that's not the case. It is a daily reprieve. Families have a daily reprieve. The client has a daily reprieve. So, however, that's what it really looks like. So when you first get sober, it is chaotic in your head. It's chaotic for family members because a lot of people think they haven't used anymore. And I had a client say, I just need to stop drinking. I don't need to go to therapy and I don't need to go to treatment. Well, if they knew how to stop drinking, I bet they would have done it, right? So this is kind of just a jumble of thoughts and feelings that family members can have. expectations that people can have on people, resentments that people have had, and just like now that they're sober, I'm going to unleash on you. Well, that's just emotionally vomiting on them. That's not doing anything but shaming them, really, and it's not helping you. Okay, so what do we do now? We might be finished like uber early, which I know nobody's going to hate, but do y'all want to take a break now? It's like 10 o'clock. Is that okay? How long do we break? 15? 10 minutes, okay. All right. Does anybody have any questions from the first half? Because I know I'm not doing such an amazing job that I'm answering everyone's questions, because that's impossible. I am not that amazing, trust me. I am not. Okay, so no. So, well, thank you. But, okay, so the next question is, now that we've been through all of this, the relapse, the addiction, understanding relapsive behaviors, so I wanted to touch on a point a gentleman had shared about, about relapse being not just the use. It's a very, very slippery slope. And what do you think it looks like if they're in treatment, if they're in relapse mode? What do you think that looks like?
Not showing up to groups.
Their actions.
Not coming to groups, anger, guilt. Well, that's kind of that can be a trigger for sure, but that's something that I think they struggle with.
Rationalizing.
Yep. Avoiding, yeah.
Not like when you're in group and somebody confronts a behavior, like storming out.
Yeah, storming out. That was my favorite, the dramatic storm out. I'm leaving. Frustration. Yeah. Can you say that again?
I had a client that I could tell where she was by the way she dressed.
Oh, the way they dress. That's a very good one. Especially people that are bipolar, especially women. Sometimes the way they dress says a lot about where they are. I had a client that was like that, and she had a really bad disease, but she would come to group. I thought she was going to the club. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. I watched her walk down the hall, and I was like, okay. And then when you work with young people, they do the he and she-ing in the group. So one day, dude's got this old vintage, metal band T-shirt on, like Metallica or something. And the next day, I see the girl walking down the hall with it. I looked at her. I said, girl, you got to do better than that. What do you mean? I said, what shirt do you have on? And she was like this big, and dude was like this, So part of it is, thank you. Part of it is clothing that they wear. Definitely. What else?
Being
Overly agreeable. Yes, that's a good one. You're right. I should go to another treatment for 25 years. Yes, I should absolutely do that. What else? What about if you're in residential treatment, you have sketchy people on campus? That was always a big clue about who's visiting them. Just sketchy stuff, right? We had a client who was married, and he wanted to know if he could bring his girlfriend to the family program the weekend after his wife was there. I said, how is that sober behavior? I need you to help me understand that. So what else? I can't make it up. Okay, so part of it is as a staff, a clinician, etc., is helping the client discover what their own motivation for recovery is. There are a lot of things that will get them in the door: legal, a judge, the ultimatums that come. A ton of stuff gets them in the door. Sometimes they come from a psych hospital to residential or to IOP. Sometimes they come from another residential facility and they step down to IOP. So it's always good to continue to have that discussion about why are you sober? Why do you want to get sober? What's your motivation to do that? Because that's going to help you understand their behavior. It's going to help you understand their cash value. Everybody's got a cash point, right? And I don't mean money. If my cash point is I don't want to go to jail, so I'm going to do this treatment program and I'm going to be perfect, that helps you understand that. And everybody in this room has had a client that is like that, or 2 or 10. And so what I like to ask them is, why don't we try to do what we can do so you can get the most out of being here? You need to make the most of your time. No, you don't want to be here. So why don't we take a look at what do you want to learn? right? So you meet them where they are. And a lot of times it's hard because there are a lot of people that work in the field that are in recovery, that are sober, and sometimes you want to drag them into recovery, but that's for your benefit and not theirs, you know? And sometimes we want to prevent people from going down that path, but my sponsor always talks about don't deny somebody their experience, and that works clinically as well. So the other question is treatment really needed? You know, let's say somebody is in the community and they're a loved one of yours, or it's a former client and they relapse for a week, right? Do they need detox? Do they need to go to treatment? What do they need? Because it's just as unethical to provide too much treatment as it is not enough. It's just as ethical to do both of those. It does depend on the situation, but that's where you need to advocate. I've had clients before that have relapsed, and they went to the psych hospital, and then they went back to sober living, and they didn't want to tell their PO because they were going to be put in jail. And I've said to POs, it will do this person no benefit to have them locked up because they did exactly what they were supposed to do. They called me from the hospital. They went to sober living. They came back to IOP. They are still doing drug screens. They're still clean. How is you locking them up going to help them do anything? What message is that sending them? And some POs don't lock them up. So that's where you can be an advocate for your client. So do they need to return to meetings? Do they need to go to a therapist? Do they need to get another sponsor? Maybe sober living is something that needs to happen. You know, if you have clients that come through and they've never done IOP, well, maybe you need to go to IOP. There's some people that I don't care what happens to them. Sometimes they're so treatment savvy, they could run the damn place. I mean, you have to really be concrete and ask yourself that question. Is that really going to help them? Is it going to be better for them to go to sober living, go to a 12-step meeting every day, and have a sponsor and see you twice a week with random drug screens? Is that more helpful than going to residential treatment for 30 days where they're going to be like, dude, I've already done this before? Right? So the next one is not shaming. I put shaming on there. I thought you would know better. Why did you let this happen? You know, that shames people. They know that they have made a mistake. They have tons of feelings that they're not going to share with you. So telling them, why did you let this happen? How is that going to be helpful to them? Right? Shaming people or punishing people does not equal treatment. It does not equal recovery. It equals people being deceptive. So you have to stop and think about that too. And the worst thing anybody can do is to shame them at any point in time. You can always say, is there somebody I can call for you? Is there a therapist I can call for you? If you're a loved one or if it's a friend of yours, is there somebody that I can call for you that's going to support you and help you? Do I need to take you to detox? Those are all questions that you can ask them and have an open dialogue with them about. And you can also say, what can I do to support you? I would have so many family members that would say, tell me what I need to do to support them. And I'm like, well, why don't you ask them? Like, you're not going home with me. Why don't you ask them what they need? The client might not even know what they need. They might just need to say, I just need to know you still love me. That might be all they need in that moment. So asking the client, what can I do to support you? And it goes back to what Kevin McCauley said about giving somebody permission to call you out. That might be what they need. Sometimes they don't know what they need. And also, too, we have to take care of ourselves because there's a lot of vicarious trauma that clinicians have or anybody in the helping field has because of things that we hear our clients say, things that we've witnessed. I had a 16-year-old that overdosed and had to be Narcan twice, and he came in and, you know, I've got 2 kids of my own, and I'm thinking, holy crap. And the mother would look completely terrified, and this kid had been sober over 30 days because he'd been in residential. You know, it's horrifying as a parent to have that happen. And when you're sitting there hearing the kid, and then you hear the parent, and then you've got kids, you internalize all that stuff. So then what do you do with all that? Go and be overprotective over your kids? That's probably not healthy. Be overprotective about this one client? It's definitely not healthy, right? So you have to be able to take care of yourself and figure out, that's why I asked that question, what do you do to relax? What do? You have to be able to do that because we're role models for our clients, whether we ever say that or not. If they see us come, they can pick up our stress in a millisecond. I mean, they see that crap coming. So when I was working in treatment, people say, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, I just didn't sleep well last night. I'm kind of tired, but it's good. It's okay." I don't have to go into why. I don't have to go into the detail. I don't have to go into that. It's just acknowledging something they already know, because we want them to be honest. So we have to model some of that for them. Part of it is not having substances in the home, or if they're coming to visit, just make that like a blanket thing. Like, tell your family members, don't have anything in the house. I've heard families say, "But I don't have a problem. Why? It's my house." But do you love this person? Do you want to support this person? Then don't have it out. It's really simple. If you honestly don't have a problem with it, it will not be an issue for you to not have that in your house. I mean, would you have blow laying on the table? You know, would you have a little heroin tucked up there in a bottle? I mean, no, you wouldn't do that, right? So if there are medications, and I talked to families about this, if there are medications that you have, keep it in a lockbox. We all want to trust people, but in early recovery, it's hard. You don't want to have stuff like right up in their face. At Thanksgiving, my mother is like such an earth person, but she drinks a glass of red wine, and she always has, like, you know how people like a wide space when they sit down, and she always puts it over here in front of me, and I'm like, so I just move it over. Oh my God, are you going to relapse? No, I don't want to smell it. You know? But in her mind, that's where she goes, right? So the biggest thing is you can't control or fix them. And there are a lot of clinicians that think they can because they trust me. I'm the only one they trust. Run, Forrest, run. If a client ever tells you that, that is so unhealthy. You're the only one I can talk to. I don't think so. Because if you believe that, that's your ego feeding into I'm that powerful that I can just help this one person, right? And that's all about you. So you got to check that out too. But you also have to make sure that clients, what do we tell clients? You have to have a lot of people around you. I am not the only person that you can talk to about this. Any questions? Yes.
Because I'm a private practice in Richmond, and I have recommended some people to the Farley, specifically because their family could come and be part of that process. So when you said to have people go further, does that impact families' ability to go
Well,
further?
it can impact it, but I think it depends on the person. Some people just aren't willing to go far away, and so if the goal is to get them in treatment, get them in treatment. And I'm not saying that there are facilities that are farther away just because that might be the best, but sometimes it can be more challenging, especially if it's an unhealthy family system where it's really toxic. When I worked here, we would have some family members that we would not allow to visit because it was so toxic for the patient. So you really have to look at that I mean, there's only one day of visitation anyway. So you have to just look at that at what's best for your client.
And the whole, like say 30 days would be one day of visitation?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we do every other weekend now.
The family weekend, yeah, I've been
Yeah,
gone a while.
yeah.
So during family weekend, if they're in the family program, they can do that. So I know at some other treatment centers, like Mount Regis is in Salem, Virginia, and the only way a family can visit is if the family members go through their 7-hour family program before they can visit their patient, which is very smart. And they have visitation on like a Friday night. So I think it's good as a clinician to call that treatment center and say, can you tell me what that policy is? Can you tell me what that's like? And you can do it with a client in there. I've pulled stuff up online before so clients can see the treatment center because there's so much anxiety about I'm going to go away and all that kind of stuff that goes on. Hang on one second. Yes, ma'am, and then I'll get you.
Feel as though we are their own emotional or social support because the substance abuse that they have has caused them to not have relationships with family.
Yeah.
And so they feel alone. And then I'm in a case manager, so as a case manager, it feels like, well, you're the only one who's actually here for me. So how do you handle that? I guess to get something because that's how they really feel. They
Right.
know that.
Right, and that probably is a benefit for them, but also the conversation to have is, I'm glad you really feel that way, but you're not always going to need me for treatment. So this is why you need to build your support system and have other people that you can talk to, whether that's through a church, whether that's through meetings, whether that's through just other sober people in the community. So that's how you can phrase it to them so they don't feel like you're shaming them or trying to cut them off because obviously they trust you. So that's the other part of what you can do is really encourage them and talk about this is why, because I've told clients before, you're not always going to be in therapy. Like if you're always in therapy, then I'm doing something very wrong because the goal is not to be in therapy all the time. So does that make sense? To talk to them, because you're a touchstone for them, and I get that. And you know, I've seen it happen in residential and outpatient, that they just feel connected, and that's an honor for someone to feel that way, but it's also part of our responsibility to say, we need to enlarge this circle for you, and this is what we can do to do that. Okay, yes, sir.
I mean, families have their own separate issues.
Yep.
And they need to address those.
Yep.
Right? And if they don't understand their own issues, it complicates the recovery.
Absolutely.
The addict.
Absolutely. Did everybody hear what this gentleman said? Can you say it loud and be proud?
Sorry. Families have their own issues that have to be addressed. They have their own recovery process that they have to get into. And if they try to interact with the addict and don't understand that they have completely separate issues, related and separate issues, it just complicates things immensely.
Yeah. The families are the hardest to work with. Can I get amen? Because they are always going to be the most difficult to work with for that very reason, because there's all this baggage they have, there's all of this leftover stuff they have, and it can be, like if you have a child or a husband that's an alcoholic and you were raised with an alcoholic parent, you've got all that crap that's coming forward to deal with this person that is not yours, maybe not that person's to deal with. So that's why I'm very honest with families about them having their own therapist that they can talk to. And there's a way to do that that's not insulting or disrespectful. And if they say they're not going to do it, then say, well, then we need to talk about how we're going to be able to manage this, because right now, you know, this is not healthy for this client. Anybody else? Yes.
We used to ask, where I used to work, we used to ask this question all the time. What's going to be different when you go home?
Yep.
They've been in a 30-day program,
Yep.
60-day program. And many of them are going back in the family that
Yes.
are using.
Yes.
And then, what is going to be different? And most of the time they had no idea.
Yeah. So what she said was she would talk to her clients and say, what's going to be different when you go home? Because sometimes they're returning to a home where there's substance use. And that's what they have. So that's where you can take a look at sober living and have conversations with them about sober living, because that's going to provide them a sober support to where they do have those sober supports that you were talking about how to, because you're living in a house and there are ways to investigate that to determine, is it just a bunch of people living in a house and they're saying it's a sober house, or does it have some structure to it? And that's a great way to help that client and advocate for them to get them to a place where they can really pursue their recovery in a healthy way, and still have some separation from their family. Yes.
When you were talking about having families to go to therapy to help the person have addiction, are you including young children into that awareness as well?
The question was about including young children in therapy, and it depends on how young. Depends on how young they are. If they're really, really little, I would say no, because I would say send them to a child therapist who you can work with, because addiction impacts everybody. So that little person, their brain is still developing, and there's still things that they might not be aware of. So play therapy might be the best thing for them. And if you come to your traditional therapist, they're going to do talk therapy, and they don't have the skill set for that. So I think looking at some kind of therapy, also doing some education with the family on kind of some behaviors to look out for. A lot of times with kids, there can be a lot of regression in terms of they might be potty trained, but now they're bedwetting, or they're having accidents. They might be more aggressive. They might be more clingy. So educating the family on how do you manage that can a lot of times be the most helpful thing.
Well, I am a registered play therapist.
Okay.
Mad
props.
And sometimes I wonder how far can you bring that addicted parent together with that. You know, and I agree, the age is important.
Yeah.
That if it's a 10, 12-year-old, especially the 12-year-old
Mhm.
going into adolescence,
Mm-hmm.
because they'll be also exposed
Right.
soon to substances.
Right.
And
Right.
So that's a tricky
It's tricky,
area.
but I think it depends on the person. It depends on where they are. It depends on the child. There's some kids that grow up. I'll get you in 1 second. There's some kids that grow up in addictive families that they appear much more emotionally mature than they are, but they're really not. And so you might think, oh, they can handle it, and they really can't.
No, and what I see the most is they feel responsible.
Yes.
and they are the ones trying to keep them hopeful.
Yes.
This time it will work.
Right, and so a lot of times that session could be like that person that's in recovery talk about to that child in a session, this is not your responsibility to take care of mom or dad. And to have that dialogue with them. But that person that does that is going to have to be really healthy. And because I've seen a lot of families that they use that young child as their emotional sponge, and they draw from them, and that's where that comes from, you know.
And that's what the relapse comes into
Yes.
place, because the child is so hopeful.
Yes.
And sometimes I found myself thinking, oh my gosh, this parent's going to relapse.
Yeah.
So
part of it is helping them understand as best they can about like mindfulness, how to stay in the day. Drawing really helps. I worked at SCAN, Stop Child Abuse Now, and that was one of the things that they would do is to draw, because that was something that really helped them. And so I found them giving them some techniques that they could use that were just their own was really helpful for them.
right, it's just the question of how real can you make it for them.
And I think that depends on the client. I think, a 12-year-old might seem really emotionally mature, but their brain's not developed, so they can't be. So you have to really base it on, yeah. Yes.
I still go back to Sam Schiff's Clearinghouse material. There's a really good material in the book on the bubblegum family. You read it to them, and then there's a story about Pepper. Pepper is like a dog because the dad's drinking. So it's a video you can share with them if they're at that age, or there's a letter to my addiction.
Yeah.
At that level, that they can understand, and then of course we draw.
Yeah.
And lots of different sources from Sam Schiff.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any thoughts on, we know that this can also be relapsing disease where people come back and come back. And where I work, they don't have any time limits. But we will often see people that spend 3 and 4 months out 3 weeks trying to get back into the program. And the core of our program is exactly the same as it was when they were there 3 weeks ago. So what are your thoughts on that? Because to me, it just seems like they haven't used the tools that they wanted.
Well, part of it too is you don't really know. Just because they've relapsed doesn't equate to they haven't used some tools. So I think, sometimes having them go to a therapist, or maybe really focusing, and I don't know anything about your program. I don't know if it's like just a certain structure that just is very cyclic in nature, and I don't know how that is. But I think part of it is to not make assumptions about them not using tools, because when I have clients at relapse, I always am like, tell me what happened. And there are this, I don't have a whiteboard, but I would do an anatomy of a relapse. So I would have the client in front of a whiteboard and I would ask them, what is the first thing you remember about things started slipping? And they would say whatever. And so I'd write it up here. And so I get them to do that, and I get them to talk about as much as they can until at the very bottom they talk about they used. So then we go back and I say, well, what in here, where can you have intervened on yourself? And it's great to do with the group, because you can get the group to give them feedback about how do you intervene on yourself. Well, up here, when I was having this really negative thinking, I could have called my sponsor and gone to a meeting and shared in a meeting.
Gorski actually has a...
Yes, he does. Gorski has a lot of, yeah, he does. Gorski has everything. But part of it is to do that work with them and to ask those questions about that and have that connection with them so they can understand more about their use. And
The change up here.
yeah, it does. Yeah. So I don't even know if I answered your question, but it's hard to say.
Sometimes they'll say, like, I was going to meetings, but I wasn't really, up
Yeah.
here, I was like, wherever.
Just
like,
taking up there.
maybe use them.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Some people use, like you said, they'll use alcohol or drugs or smoke weed or whatever. Some people use foods. And that's the bigger issue, because you have high blood pressure, you got excessive weight gain, and that also causes people to have mental instabilities as well, because that you have body dysmorphism, because people see themselves as huge and big, and then that's another issue. So you have to, my thing is, I think people have to be careful in what they use to
Absolutely.
comfort them.
And some of that can come into play once they're sober. They can, they start eating again and they're doing that. So it's always going to be, how do you advocate for them and ask them, why did you have 4 cheeseburgers? what's going on with that. And sometimes the answer is because I wanted to feel differently, and at least I didn't use heroin.
And that's an answer too. Some people say, okay, well, that's better than drinking.
But that's like a BS defense. I mean, that's all that is. And see, if you call them out on that, then
I try, but it's they try to convince themselves that it's really true.
Right.
And it's hard to pick that apart, pick that
It
from
is.
them. So
It is,
that
but
was something I ran into with some of my clients of residents of people who use other devices or other substances and things, and they cause themselves to have bigger issues.
They do, but one thing to always ask your clients is, what are you willing to do to get for your sobriety today? Ask them that question, what are you willing to do for your sobriety? And that'll tell you where they are, and then you can base what you talk about on that. I mean, it's like, sometimes it's like playing whack-a-mole, I mean, it really is. And sometimes clients have to go through that process of what you talked about and what other people talked about to get to a place where they're sober and they aren't engaging in those hurtful behaviors anymore. Anybody else? Okay, so this is about being an ally. So there are always ways that we can help people. There are always ways, and I don't mean just as clinicians or social workers or case managers, but think about, is there somebody in your life that's impacted you positively? And who is that person? And who is that person? That's a question. Parents?
Sometimes it's like uncles or aunts.
Okay, but think about your own life, not just somebody who could do it. I want you to think about personally, who has impacted your life?
High school teacher.
High school teacher. What did they do for you?
She encouraged me to keep painting and drawing.
Okay, right? And you obviously did, right? So all along our path in life, we will continue to have people that influence us, and it's not just when we were young. It's no matter how old we are. So think about that, okay? And then think about what they said or did that impacted your life in some way. She encouraged you to continue to paint. How did your parents support you? Whoever said that? Somebody said parents. Yes, ma'am.
I mean, lots of different ways. Encouraged me to explore things in life that I was interested in. Encouraged me to hang out with better people. Discipline.
Okay. Same thing. Anybody else? Back of the room. I can walk back there. When I worked in treatment, I used to call that death row. Back there. Okay. You weren't judged, yes. Right? So we've talked about how does that person's message continue to impact you today. One of the things that I had shared with somebody at the break is when I was in graduate school, one of my professors said, and he told the class this, he said, it doesn't matter how many initials you have before or after your name. If you do not connect with your client, it is pointless. And I never forgot that. I never forgot that. Because it is a village that helps people get sober. It is not ever one person. Ever. I don't care what they tell you. It is not ever one person. Right? So part of it is we have to take a look at how do we coordinate this village? Who do we need to get a release for to talk to help that person if they're willing to sign it? Who do we bring in that's going to be supportive for them? Right? And the way to do that is to think about your own life and who were the allies for you? Who is rooting for you in your corner? And then sometimes we can get so shaming with our clients because now I have to do another treatment plan. Now I have to do another this, and now I have to do another that. And, and I think if clients could read our thoughts like little speech bubbles over our head, we'd all be in trouble, But that's why it's good that we have each other that we have conversations with and that we figure out what do I need to do to get my crap straight and stay in my lane so I can help you the most. And that's why I always go back to who are the allies that you have in your life, how they've impacted you, and how can you be that ally for your client. Because when you look at the work we do in that way, it completely changes the lenses that you look through. You don't look at them as a disease. You don't look at them as that bipolar person that has blah, blah, blah. You know, you don't look, it's dehumanizing to say that. We've all said that before. Oh man, I know she's got access to stuff going on, right? Who hasn't said that before, right? But part of the problem is that if we continue to live in that environment, then that is how we react to our clients. Just like if our clients continue to hang around people that aren't supportive, that is what they show out too. So that's why we have to constantly keep our stuff in check and understand who are our allies. What can we do? Again, a supervisor I've had a lot of supervisors that have really impacted the way I do my work, because I was talking to him about this woman that I was seeing. I worked in Amelia Community Services Board, and I was the woman who worked with women who would have their kids taken from them from social services because of their drug addiction. I don't know how I got tapped to do that, but that was my path. So this one woman, she had a horrible history herself. I mean, anyway, so she wasn't coming in, wanted to get her kids back. So I was talking to my supervisor about it, and he was like this dude about this high, rode a bike, had an old white goatee, and was like $120. Like he was like this big around. And he would do this role play. And I would think, this is like the most ridiculous thing this man is doing. But it was so helpful, because he says to me, well, have you told your client you're frustrated with her? I'm like, I can't do that. He's like, well, why can't you say that? I said, well, I don't know. So we role played how to have that conversation. So she came in and she started talking about that, and I stopped her and I said, I believe you that you want to get your daughter back. I said, but it feels very frustrating to me when you're in session and you tell me this is what you want, and then you miss 5 sessions and we only have this time frame. What do you think that's about for you? And she talked about how afraid she was. And she talked about, what if I don't get my kids back? And I said, then how about we just talk about that in here? And we have that dialogue and that conversation. Had I not told my supervisor that, we would not have had that conversation. So that's why it's always good to look at the allies. We don't work in silos. We have to work together. And there's so many treatment centers around here. It's not a competition. Like, nobody gets out of this thing alive anyway, right? So why not have all of us work together on this? And that's why I put the ally part in there, because we know what it's like to have somebody support us. So that's really what recovery is like. A lot of people, when they first get in the field, think it is a complete straight line. It's linear, point A, point B, it's just like that. It's never, life isn't like that, right? So when you look at recovery, and this is a great thing to show your client, because a lot of clients feel like, well, they should on themselves, like, well, I've been sober 2 weeks, I should know how to manage this, or I've been sober a year, and then you pull this out and say, but is this how this feels, the reality piece? And they're like, yeah, okay, then why do you have that expectation? Because as we know, expectations are breeding grounds for resentments. So why do you have that expectation that you're supposed to know how to do all of this stuff when you're still learning? And that normalizes it for them. It helps them understand that this is a process, and we continually have to use this to give them education. And we can also do this to educate other people as well. There are people I've worked with in treatment that have no daggone business working in treatment. I mean, none. I had a supervisor. I used to work at Virginia Monitoring, and that was the first monitoring company for addicted professionals, for healthcare professionals. So I was working in Farmville, and the clinical director there, we needed a new child psychiatrist. And I'm thinking, well, this is perfect for somebody that's being monitored because there's no narcotics, it's short hours. This is like perfect for somebody. And it's not like Farmville is picky, like, because we covered such a vast land mass that we needed to have a child psychiatrist. And so I said this to her. So in treatment team, we had about 45 people in there, and she goes, well, would you want to supervise somebody like that? That is the clinical director that is running that clinic, and her attitude is, somebody that's in recovery, we can't supervise. So I looked at her and said, well, you supervise me and don't seem to have any problem. So I can get real sassy when that happens. But the point is that it's good to know who your allies are at work. It's good to know how to be one as well. Okay, so these are different resources that I put up for this area and for Richmond. I don't know where everybody lives, but there are a lot of different resources that are there. I've got The Pleasure Unwoven and Memo to Self by Kevin McCauley. It's Vimo or Vimo that you can actually view those on, and it's free. Spirit Works is right down the street for kids. There's also, Sherry does a lot of work with families and individual therapy, and she's out in Virginia Beach. There's also Families Anonymous in Richmond. I'm sure they have one in this area. There's a peer recovery warm line in Richmond. They're looking at that being 24 hours, but it's a great number for clients to have. If they're really struggling, they can call and they can talk to somebody and get some resources online. There's obviously 12-step meetings, and then their Family and Friends Education Program. In Richmond, they have this. It's at North Star Community Church, and they have it on Thursdays from 6:30 to 8, and it's free to come to get education, and there are a lot of different people to do presentations around that. So does anybody else have any questions about anything? Yes?
Do you have an opinion about referring people to an addictionologist?
I think it is incredibly helpful to have people that have an addiction see treatment providers that know about addiction. And there are people that are addictionologists, and then there are people that aren't, but they know a lot about addiction. So I think it's good to have those people in your community that you can really relate and work with, because it's just another layer of protection that you can help your client with. So I've just found that it's worked really well when I've worked with them. Well, if there's nothing else, I'm done. So y'all have a great afternoon, and thank you.